This is EcoCramming, and if you don't know who I am, my name is Cam, and on Twitter, I'm EcoCam, and if you aren't following me on Twitter, basically, what you're missing out on is a memified live tweeting of our ecological crisis that we're all facing by someone who has a degree in this stuff, but also a second, much cooler degree in shenanigans, which I definitely also use on my Twitter. It's pretty wholesome stuff, actually. There's lots of bad news, of course, but I like to keep things pretty pure, pretty wholesome. And this, where we are all gathered today, this is my introductory crash course lecture series of all the things I'm usually raving about on Twitter. I'm serious, like so serious, you guys, when I say that the most impactful thing that a singular person can do on a singular day to benefit themselves and their community in light of an ecological crisis like the one we're facing is to get and stay educated. Since we are actually actively fighting this right now, right here today, now is the time for everyone with the means to do so to get involved in their own education and how to familiarize themselves to the best of their ability with the academic literature at hand. Now, I know that's hard, actually pretty inaccessible. Academic literature is dense to read and expensive to get, and not to mention tedious just to look at a lot of the time. It's a lot easier to get your climate information from listicles on Twitter. Trust me, I know that. I really do know that. But those can be maddeningly surface level, and it really is important in times like these to have a strong basal knowledge of what is and what isn't. If you plan on being an alive animal who lives on Earth anytime in the near or distant future, it might be a good idea to know which things are things that the climate might do and which things are things that simply would not happen that way. If you use resources that are from the Earth, it might be good to know how resources move around and where they come from and where they might end up when you're finished being resourceful with them. And if you're going to read my Twitter account that's all about environmentalism, it might be a good thing. It might be good to know a thing or two about what that is and what it looks like in the hands of a wily 20-something. So let's start there. I feel like that's where we need to kick things off. What is an environmentalist? Who is an environmentalist? And what does it mean to do environmentalism? I'm going to do my best to answer these questions with some groovy sources and personal anecdotes from my time in academia, but I'm going to start off by noting that the actual answer is that words are fake, and the definition of this one has been tossed around so much that it's really actually almost meaningless. Like, in a topical general sense, there isn't really one clear definition at all. But what do you do with that when you need a movement to rally behind to save your whole planet? I can't deal with an empty, meaningless perception of what an environmentalist is. I need to have something I aspire for. So I'm going to start by talking about the definition of environmentalism that I started my college career with, and then we're going to talk about why that fell apart and what came to be in its place and how that new definition has been working for me. So when I was 18, I decided to go into environmental studies because I had just taken AP Advanced Placement Environmental Sciences at my high school. And let me tell you, that class got me heated. That class would make me so mad that I would literally leave fourth period fuming each day because we would watch videos of oil spills and e-waste and stuff like that, and I would leave class each time ready to dismantle all of the corporate systems that prioritize short-term growth over sustainable development. And I wanted to yell and kick and scream about this stuff so badly that that's pretty much what I wanted to go to school for. I wanted to be a professional environmentalist, which in my mind at the time meant getting into professional activism. That's probably what most people think when they hear the word environmentalist, is Greenpeace and the Whaling Boat, or, World Wildlife Fund, or what have you of that nature. And if you're talking about environmentalism as a political movement, that is basically what you mean. The environmentalist activist movement. But I think you have to be really specific about environmental activism when that's what you mean. You can't interchange it with environmentalism at free will without discounting and discrediting a whole lot of people. A whole lot of honest, hardworking, good people. The first instance in which I ever really thought to question my idea of what an environmentalist is came the summer after I first graduated from high school. I took a road trip down to California with my parents, and we stopped in the John Muir Redwood Forest, which, if you've never been, is an absolutely gorgeous national park with the biggest, tallest trees you've ever seen in your life. And yes, the wood that comprises these trees really is red. And as a park, it has all these amenities and services where there are groomed trails with information centers and education areas. And I remember so specifically being absolutely enamored by this brown-haired woman I saw. She had a side ponytail, and she was glowing, and she was dressed almost exactly like Nigel Thornberry from the Wild Thornberries, which, by the way, an excellent piece of environmentalist media. And I was, instantly in love with this woman. Instantly in love with her. She had a million pockets on her shorts and a big brimmed hat and dorky hiking boots, and I wanted to be exactly like her in that moment. Because in this moment, I saw her, she was standing in this crowd of people, mostly kids, who were, super engaged, and she sat next to one of those fat, red, mossy stumps, and she started talking about all of her, ancient forbidden tree secret knowledge that she had that I'd never encountered in my life, like secret ancient forest wisdoms, basically. And she actually had everyone so entranced, telling us about how, when trees get stressed, they can start spudding, which is something I really feel like I should have and could have known before then, but she had the knowledge, she had the receipts. And I was like, how do I become the woman who has so many pockets and secret tree knowledge to share with school kids? And it occurred to me right away that I needed to find a way to include people like her in my definition of the word environmentalist, because she wasn't a political activist, at least not in that capacity, but what she was doing was still environmentalism, because it was, in its own way, an advocacy for nature. It was an advocacy for people to pay attention to nature, to notice what was happening, and to champion growth in life in the natural sense. It was an advocacy for the authority and intelligence of nature, for the autonomy of nature, for the self-expression that takes place there. And, I don't know why I wouldn't consider that environmentalist work. This woman, by the way, was, in fact, a national park ranger. And my definition of environmentalist that I like to use definitely includes that kind of line of work. As they are, despite being outside of policy, advocates in the way that they help things grow. So now I'm thinking that maybe environmentalists are political activists, but they're also what I now know to call conservationists, people who protect the land. That word, conservationist, is super interesting because it's tied to the very early environmental movement. It's like John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt, who, if you don't know, are pretty solely responsible for the establishment of the National Park Service, which is probably one of the greatest feats of American conservation. So, in my head, I'm forming this idea of the old environmentalism, which involves protecting the land and trudging through forests like John Muir and is sometimes called conservationism, and the new environmentalism, which is more like Greenpeace, World Wildlife Fund type beats. So that's the idea I went to college with, that there's this sort of two-front battle going on, and that really are hand in hand and belong under the same umbrella term. Now, that's not a terrible way of breaking down the word environmentalism. What I really like about it, actually, is how it emphasizes the duality between the efficacy of policy with the simplicity and the earnestness of supporting nature. But just like what happened with pretty much every other idea I had when I was 18, I went to college and my mind changed as ideas expanded, and also I met the weirdest, coolest old guy. I love old people, and this is one of my all-time favorite old people. His name is Dr. Mark Fiji, and he's a professor at Montana State University, which is where I got my undergraduate degree. He was my professor. He's in the history department. He works in environmental history. He's a big advocate of the environmental humanities. I took a class with him called American Environmental History, which is kind of silly that it's called that, because with the content of the class, it wasn't all exclusively American. It wasn't exclusively American writers nor an American perspective. And it was also only vaguely a history course in that we discussed parts of the history of the conservation movement as we went, but a lot of the reading and writing that we actually did was very contemporary. So it was American environmental history, but it wasn't American and it wasn't all history. It was really a seminar on environmentalism. Dr. Fiji was thorough about his definitions the way I'd like to be. I think it's important to be upfront with people about your terminology. So he definitely took quite some time to define words like environmentalist. He's this super cool, kooky old guy with a silver ponytail and zip-off shorts who knows nothing about technology. He calls himself Professor Paleo because he can't send emails. This guy, he actually did this thing for the final for the class. We were supposed to go up to his house. He had a few acres in the middle of nowhere in Montana, and we were supposed to go up there and learn how to chop wood to connect with the history of environment and being an environmentalist. It's the kind of guy that you just is. That was homework, And it's my understanding, as far as this what is an environmentalist thing goes, that he's slightly more in the camp of this term is meaningless. Although clearly through his teaching, he saw some avail to attempting to define it and establishing boundaries for the definition of it. And one thing he really imprinted on me through our discussions is that people like loggers and hunters and ranchers should be considered environmentalists. And that was really weird for me at first. I was thinking, really? Loggers? Those guys who cut down trees and destroy the environment? But Dr. Fiji argued that yes, the logger and the political activists have something really important in common that warrants putting them under a similar umbrella term. And it's that their life work has an inherent reliance on the land and on the ecosystem. The environment is at the heart of what all these people do. So how could we deny them, the loggers, the title of environmentalist? Would it be because the political beliefs don't align? Because that seems sort of arbitrary to the point. Whether or not you agree with their methods, loggers advocate for the economic and cultural value of forests. They regulate forests. They act as ecosystem engineers within forests. As much as a national park ranger is an environmentalist, a logger is too. Having that teaching really changed my personal understanding of the term, because it was the first time I started thinking about the power of inclusiveness when thinking about what is an environmentalist. It started gearing me towards wanting to stretch the definition to maybe include some adversaries, because I'm sitting there now almost 20 years old thinking about how powerful it would be if I could look at these loggers, some of these ranchers, maybe even some of these oil guys, and say, hey, I consider us as being on the same side. We both have to find a way to make this thing work. That could really change the framework of the mission, And then later on, at 21, I got some time to really think about that, even in reverse. What happens if we do, break down the definition of the word environmentalist, make it smaller and smaller and start kicking people out? What would that do? And I was taking this writing class about plant rhetorics, and what we're talking about is epistemologies, or worldviews on plants and where they come from and how they develop. We spent a lot of time talking about Aristotle is largely responsible for the way a lot of thinking and knowing goes on today in the Western world, and we talked about how that happened and how we got here as far as what our cultural understandings are. One thing that came up in one of our readings, we were reading about the writer Val Plumwood, who was an environmentalist and ecofeminist writer from Australia, whom I admire very much. And she wrote about, essentially, how fractionalization is really bad for emerging epistemologies. That sort of dissolution, that separation of thinkers, and by extension, separation of thought, it stops things that could have had cultural impact from spreading. When Plumwood talked about this stuff, she was talking a lot about the forced dualism of these kinds of imposed opposites that popped up in our culture, like man versus woman, or cats and dogs, which have no business, by the way, being opposites, but they're perceived that way culturally. And Plumwood wrote about how having these imposed dualisms keeps people apart, which keeps ideas apart from developing and spreading, which leads to dissolution of thought. So if we think of the imposed opposite as environmentalist versus non-environmentalist, you start to see a problem with excluding anyone from the movement. On an interpersonal cultural level, there's people who use reusable shopping bags and mason jars and stuff like that who are environmentalists, and then there are people who use plastic bags who aren't. But if we let that rigidness of that imposed opposite soften a little bit, it becomes clearer to see the way even plastic buying guy lives on the land. He's part of the resource and nutrient cycling on this planet. He filters his air with his lungs, and I'm pretty sure he has a favorite flower. And if plastic buying guy starts to see that in himself and starts to think of himself as inextricably an environmentalist, maybe he'd be less inclined to buy so much plastic. You know what I mean? Everyone has the potential to be an environmentalist, and it's better to help people see that potential in themselves than cast people out who don't see it on their own. Because something like this, a large-scale ecological crisis like this one, this is an all-hands-on-deck situation. Every person has to be involved in keeping people alive and keeping our economy afloat as our access to resources changes. And you know what? I want to include the ranchers and loggers and plastic buyers. I want them to feel involved and responsible in this. So, just to be clear, the definition of environmentalist that I'm currently working under isn't everyone. But what's important about the definition I'm using is that it could be anyone. The definition of environmentalism that I like best right now is anyone who works on, for, or with the land. It's civil servants, it's farmers, it's your mom in her garden. And you know, us humans, we're capable of wearing many hats and possessing duality. So you can be one type of environmentalist at some times and a different sort at others. When you strip mine a mountain, you ruined a mountain, but also you did create a circumstance for primary succession to occur, which is no doubt a major ecosystem function. You weren't being a very nice environmentalist, not a very kind one. You probably won't make the other environmentalists very happy, but you're still out there working on the ecosystem in an effort to survive on Earth, which is what environmentalism is, in my mind. Whether or not you take responsibility for the fact that you're doing environmental work, that's up to you, but you can't avoid it. This all reminds me of a time I sat down and had coffee with a friend of mine who's super on board with the reduced waste movement, like on a personal level. Like, she personally makes minuscule amounts of trash and has devoted much time and energy into doing so. And I asked her about how she felt about calling herself an environmentalist, and she said she doesn't think of herself that way. And I thought that was bonkers. I said, if not you, then who? Like, I'm talking to a lady who makes like a jar of trash a month. If she's not an environmentalist, then who? Like, no one is. Who is? Nobody is. But she really thought that she wasn't. And it's because she wasn't on the steps of the Capitol building doing intense lobbying or anything like that. And I told her what I heard about the loggers and what I was thinking about the plastic men. And, eventually, I did get her to say, okay, I see your point. Maybe I should be an environmentalist. And I think that's a really important effect to be able to have on somebody, because it gives you the confidence you need to make moves in the name of environmentalism. It gives you it takes confidence to do anything, It takes confidence to get out of bed in the morning. If you can get someone to confidently call themselves an environmentalist, you open the doors for a lot of action. This particular friend teaches workshops now and is super powerful and amazing. But just to think this literal zero waste instructor just a few months ago had never positioned herself in the term environmentalist and never saw herself that way. And I think just maybe the world could be a better place if more people did. We could see a lot more intention and drive, which we certainly need more of with something like this going on. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed your time here. I'm EcoCam, and this is EcoCramming, my introductory crash course podcast to my Twitter account, EcoCam, just to keep the people updated, just to keep you all informed. Please stay safe, stay home, and tune in next time to hear a perspective on plant-based eating that comes from a committed part-time vegetarian who spent a lot of time debating this stuff. I once gave a speech about this to a classroom full of beef ranchers, so I'm really not messing around. I will say it all. All right, see you later.